Greetings, folks. This is Scott, and you're tuning into A Woman's Place, the podcast where we break down all the policies and politics that affect the 51%. That's right, women are half the US population, and Ashley and I are here to give you the facts about how today's events are affecting them. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Welcome back. Hello, Ashley Brown, as I always like to say.
And I like that we use full names. Hello,
Yes.
Scott Osborne. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Are you okay today?
You know, I
Happy
am.
Thursday.
I am.
Happy end of February. Tomorrow's the last day of February.
That's the only thing that's a little shocking is how fast this year has started off. And how is it marked? We're in the last month of the first quarter, which is shocking. But
No, actually, January, February, March is the first quarter. I think we're still in the middle of the first quarter.
but tomorrow starts the last
Tomorrow
month.
starts, yes. And then we
Yes.
set the clocks ahead and all that stuff happens. That is true.
Oh my God, does that happen this weekend?
Next weekend. Next
Oh,
weekend.
boo.
Yeah.
Boo.
Yeah.
Anyway, none of what we're
Anyway.
talking about.
And we're back on DEI, so it's a little bit of a Groundhog Day, only not really, because we're going to be moving forward. We're nominally on the same topic, but we're picking up. You'll remember last week we said there was so much more to cover we wanted to come back to. So we are coming back to a little bit of DEI. We did some of the origins last week, talked a little bit about how this really came from the 60s and affirmative action, and then the changes in the last 10 to 20 years, and of course, the recent executive orders and changes just since January and how that has had an effect and what DEI really meant. But we felt there was a lot more we wanted to get into today.
Agreed. And I think one of the topics as well is we ended on why are people afraid of it? And what do we want from diversity anyway? Why is it positive? And I think arming people with the reminders of the values and benefits of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and creating that space of moving away from fear toward understanding.
And as things can become, it's funny, we mentioned at one point, it's really become sort of like a slur, a shorthand for a very derogatory thing. And in a way, I don't agree with that. Personally, I understand how things can be used that way, but it is worth saying, well, wait a minute, why did we do this? Why did we want diversity for so long anyway? Before we say, why is it that people are opposed to it? So I'm hoping that's let's get started, get into it today.
Let's get started. And something that we talked about on the last podcast that I think is a great starting point is the shift of the demographics in our country. And
Yes.
what, we are not who we were in the 1950s and 60s. So I think that's a good starting off point of where we are as a nation and as a world and what our demographics are. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Sure. And it's interesting. I mean, in a way, obviously, America's always been multicultural and diverse. We are a nation of immigrants. Unless you're from a Native American family, we're a nation of immigrants. So on the one hand, we've always been that way. But you're also right that it feels different from the 1950s. And I think a lot of that is both economic and social. Certainly, in the 1950s, our economy was so much more stratified by race and by gender. What white men could and did do, who received higher education, all of that looked very different. I mean, this is sort of this time where people either remember or heard about how, one man could sort of work in the factory and provide for a family of four. It was just a very different world. And again, that's kind of a stereotype, but there was some truth to it. That's no longer the world we live in. So those kind of changes also shift our notion of diversity. We have women who are getting more education, and we are more multicultural. We are, as some people say, browner. We are more diverse. Our Hispanic population has grown, our Asian population has grown, and we have many more people who are marrying and having children, across all kinds of race and ethnic lines. People who are truly multicultural has grown consistently since then. So we do look different than the 1950s. But I would say we've also always been multicultural. And we can come back to this later. There have always been sort of waves of opposition to it. You know, certainly after the Civil War, there were waves of opposition to Black people moving into jobs. So some of it is not new, but it's in a new guise now in 2025.
And something that we touched on as well that I'd like to dig a little deeper into is the diversity of jobs, how we're socialized towards certain jobs as men versus women, and why is diversity good for the workplace? Like, what are the benefits of having a diverse
Sure,
workforce?
sure. And then, you know, let me just go back and sort of set the stage technically who we are as a nation before we talk about who's in our workforce, because it is good for our workforce by many accounts. You know, we're about 340 million people now in America, and you know, somewhere from the 60% to 58% is white, depending on how you count white Hispanics. 62%, that's about where we are. And the rest is a mixture. You know, African Americans are about 13% of our country. People who identify as Hispanic are maybe 19 or 20. We've got this mixture. So there's a definite quote unquote majority in numbers of people who identify as white or Caucasian, but it's not an overwhelming number. It's maybe high 50s, high 60%. So that's who we are. And to some extent, again, we've always been that way. So that's our workforce. That's our shoppers, that's our consumers, that's our workers. You know, that's our people who use federal benefits. That's who we are as a nation. So I think that's worth just being clear about. That's not a matter of perspective. That's a matter of fact of who we are. Businesses, especially in recent years, have consistently found that diverse employees and diverse perspectives are advantageous. There have been many studies in 22. McKinsey put together one that noted that companies that were diverse and equitable were much more likely to meet the needs of their customers. There have been other studies by whole bunch of, there was one in 2020 with 1,000 firms that found that greater gender and ethnic diversity yielded better performance on the stock market. So we've had a lot of evidence that more different people around the tables, as we call it, yield better results. Now, let's drill down. Why should that be? The notion is that different perspectives keep people from getting siloed. And when we're siloed, we don't see enough. We're not aware of what people need. We're not aware of how enough people think or what they do or how they act. And again, this isn't always because people are intentionally trying to bias others, but a lot of it could come from our implicit biases. I have mine, you have yours. We're raised in certain ways. We have to be aware of that and recognize I need other perspectives that aren't mine to really see the world and to see the workforce. So there's a lot of evidence that workers, companies value diversity. I love this, you know, Mark Cuban, who's this obviously very successful by some accounts businessman, he is consistently on record that a workforce that is diverse and representative for stakeholders is good for business. It's going to be interesting now with so much pushback to see how companies manage this. You know, companies do respect the bottom line, and their shareholders certainly do. So if they know that diversity is good, and there's pressure to remove some of their quote unquote DEI initiatives, they're going to have to find other ways to be diverse because it's good business. So that's kind of the business piece. That's a long argument, a long answer, I think, Ashley, to what you asked. But that's the business case that we do see.
Well, and I think it's not when we talk about our implicit bias and the importance of having different perspectives at the table. I also think we need to talk about the fact it's not just about gender or race. It's your lived experience. If you grew up in the same neighborhood, if you went to the same places of faith or the same schools, that's also a part of diversification. It's not just about I am female or I am male or I am
Absolutely.
Black or I am Caucasian, of just being mindful of the echo chambers that we find ourselves in and being intentional about inviting other voices with different experiences to the table. So we're creating, whether it's a workplace policy or a legislative policy that's reflective of the needs of everyone we're trying to serve or work with.
Well, that's a good point. And I mean, let's be fair. I guess I would say fairly recent, very evolved point. That takes people who have some security and maturity who are willing to say, okay, I can be uncomfortable with people who are different than I am, whether it's literally in a workforce, in a conversation. Most people, maybe most humans, prefer people who are like them, in many ways. And so it takes time and practice to recognize the value, the benefit, especially if you did not grow up in a diverse environment. For people who grow up in a very diverse environment, for whatever reason, it comes naturally. But for people who don't, which through no fault of their own is the way most Americans live, they grow up in one town or one village, they see what that represents. It can be new to see and hear other people's perspectives and realize that the one you grew up with is not the only one there. That's a very human. That's not just American. That's a very human thing.
And it's not a bad thing, but being aware of it, conscious of it, and to ensure that you're not unwilling to listen. And I think tying in a conversation we were having before we went to tape, the fact that people are uncomfortable being exposed to or listening to ideas or opinions that are different than theirs is something we've gotten worse at that. We've gotten
We are
worse
certainly in a bad way at the moment. Yes, we were having a conversation about how what I will colloquially call both sides of our political dynamic now really seem to struggle to even hear or be exposed to the other perspective. They just find it so challenging. And I personally think that's a very dangerous and disappointing place to be in. We can all form our opinions. We may differ, but that we can't even be exposed to in some senses and hear and respectfully listen to the other side does not bode well for the compromise that our country has to have. Let's go back to that. This is who we are as a nation. We are not a small homogeneous nation where we can assume everybody has the same lived experiences and the same color skin or whatever it might be. We never will be. So I think adapting to that is a matter of necessity in our country. It should be.
And I think that there are times that it's really difficult, especially with some of the narratives that are being put forth that seem obvious, of misguided, or that personally I would never agree with, but being able to listen, have a conversation, and build a back and forth, because if we don't get to that point, we're going to be stuck in this cycle of nothing moving forward. The continuation of compromise or finding a shared path is more elusive than it's been in years, and I think it's important. So I think it's a good reminder of, if you find yourself always running away from a different perspective, maybe think about that for a second and find ways that you can engage in conversation with people who have different ideologies than you do.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we could have a whole conversation about this and why there's some different things for women, how it presents. Because it was certainly in the extreme, but that sort of brings us to a topic I wanted to talk about, which is a little bit about media and why media is especially important, I would argue, to have diversity. This is one I've thought about a lot. And do you have any idea how many hours the average person is exposed to media in a given day now in the first quarter of the 21st century?
So this is including our handheld devices that are.
This is including whatever platform it comes to us on.
So percentage, are we daily?
Or number of hours. Number of hours.
Oh gosh. 3.
3?
It's worse.
All media?
Isn't it?
We're between 12 and 13 hours a day. And that's internet.
My God.
That's television. That's the social medias again, which is internet. That also includes radio and print media. So people who do read newspapers, etc., includes radio, podcasts. So the point is, we are constantly consuming media. It's just coming to us from all directions. And media is so influential in shaping who we are, how we think, how we dress, how we act, the careers we aspire to or not, how we raise our children, how we talk to our partners, how we see other people. So informed by this. We're not just the products of our family or maybe our schools anymore. We're in the products of all this other information from media. So because of that foundational role, having diverse perspectives in media is very important. Again, not just to make me happy, but if we want to have an accurate representation of our country in the world. And media is one area that it is very undiverse. It is very uniform of people who create it. And people who create media tend to make things that reflect their perspective.
Well,
in terms of gender, yes, 75% of all the roles making visual media, editors, filmmakers, everything else, that's male and almost exclusively white male. So that's 3/4.
Okay, so two things. One,
Yes.
12 hours.
Yes. Yeah. All media. Now that's
I get it.
Surfing the internet. Some of that might be Amazon, but still advertisements influence us.
So that's a huge percentage. If
Yes.
we say that maybe we sleep 7 hours a day. So
that's pretty much most of our waking hours.
It's most of our waking hours. And then the other piece that I just feel it's important as we continue this conversation, when we talk about news, the shift to commentary versus news that people I don't think have fully embraced, that how I think cautious we need to be of the information we're receiving and knowing if it's opinion and commentary versus factual news reporting. And the blend of that, I think, has been really particularly damaging in some ways of how we form our opinions on things that are happening.
We don't have common trusted news sources anymore. You're right. That's a topic in itself. And there are many people who've looked at it far more than I, who write about that influence. And there's no question it's huge. We do not have trusted news sources. We have commentary. Most people get their quote unquote news now from social media, and I shouldn't say most, but many do. I don't know the exact number. But certainly the commentary and the snippets and the flattening of what is an authority. Is an authority just the person who posts on X or Instagram or whatever it is? Or is it some established newspaper? Or is it ABC News, the Washington Post, owned by a private corporation? I mean, what is a trusted news source is a very, I would say, challenging topic, but it's more than that. Let's just leave it at that.
I think we'll put that in its own episode. So back to 75% of people
of the roles. Yes, that's the most current estimate. And things like film, because I look at film a lot, 14% of film directors are female. Again, I'm just looking at female. Far fewer are people of color. So again, I sometimes say to people, look, I like to have equal opportunity. If, all the truck drivers are male, I'd like to have opportunities maybe for women to be truck drivers if they wanted to. But it's not as foundational an industry. If some guy brings your boxes to your door, it doesn't really influence you than if a woman brings something to your door. I'd like them to have those opportunities, but media does, because media is shaping us in a different way. It colors us, including advertisements. Men speak voiceovers 4 times more than women in advertisements. So think about the implicit kind of change in our systems when we hear men acting as experts, as the voice of authority all the time, without even thinking about it. That's just the ads that we get. Those are the voices of authority. Don't even think about it. We don't question it. It's just there. But the subliminal impact of all of that media does shape us. It does inform all of us. So that's why bringing diverse perspectives into making media and seeing diverse media, and really in this day and age reaching out. And I say to people, you should really watch or read some different media, because it is important. It does shape how we think. And the other interesting related one where there's a lot of uniformity is AI and our tech and our coding. And that's been watched for a long time. People have been trying to get diverse perspectives into the tech fields, but there's a lot of concern about the algorithms being created and about the dominance of AI, because software developers do bring their own biases. It may be implicit, It may be direct, but that is not neutral. Coding is not neutral. So that area is a big concern. We know that the male-dominated, Western, white male-dominated have created so much of the algorithms and the technology that now rule our lives. They create our data. They give us answers every time you Google something. There's a lot of potential for bias, and so it is an area of concern.
And balancing that with restricting DEI measures in recruiting females into STEM is the great example of, we know that there are less women in tech and engineering, in, fill in the blank of science and technology related fields. But now, with some of the executive orders and not supporting diversity, equity, inclusion measures, they're not allowed to specifically recruit women for expansion into a field. So I think that's one of those unintended consequences of, we want to scrub diversity, equity, and inclusion because it's not necessary, it's not fair. I think we'll get into a little more of that later. But when we know that we've got huge gaps in, I'm going to go with media at this point, I'm going to go with entertainment and artificial intelligence, engineering, if we can't specifically recruit or create opportunities for women to expand into this, then what kind of strides are we going to make?
Right. And the point with so-called DEI initiatives was not that less qualified women in this case should be given opportunities, but that they were not being hired under normal circumstances. Very well qualified women would not be hired without specific initiatives to break down old patterns, to break down implicit biases, to break down some of those walls that were preventing them from coming in. So let's just be clear about that. It's not that there aren't women who are qualified. It's that there have been historical biases and barriers that would have kept them out. And that's why the initiatives are important.
Absolutely. And it's the socialization of what's an appropriate job or career path. And, I think we've made great strides on expanding women in those roles, but I feel like there's a slide backwards in terms of the judgment of, if you're female, if you're a person of color, and you're in a traditionally male dominated role, you're only there because you are female or because you're a person of color, not that you're not extremely qualified, which I hate that narrative.
Yeah, and that's unfortunately pretty recent. I think when we talk about why people are opposed to these diversity initiatives, that might come. I think actively, there's human factors why people are opposed to it, which I understand. I don't like them all, but I'm very understanding and empathetic to them. And then I also recognize that these kind of issues can be used for political manipulation by actors who wish to do that. The same as we've had many other quote unquote culture war issues. They can be used to manipulate for other purposes. So even where it might not be such a huge issue, something that perhaps the people are fine with can be generated to be political. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't some human reasons why people do oppose diversity or diversity initiatives, and they're sort of, I guess I would say, understandable. One of them is the sense of restricted independence, that people might need to change their behavior or their speech in a workplace or a social setting. I mean, I don't know, neither one of us is really old enough to remember when things like country clubs and all were not open to women. And, that was a big push for many years before I was in the workforce, because women said that's where relationships were being developed, business relationships and connections were made, and you found lawyers and deals were made. And if they couldn't get into country clubs, they couldn't really be equal. And a lot of the opposition from the people who were in the country clubs was that they would essentially have to change their behavior and way of speaking and way of acting to be now in a more diverse setting. If they were just among men, the suggestion was they would act and talk and behave in a certain way. And if they let in women, they would have to change all that, which is a very interesting sociological thing, of course, why we have to deal so differently. But that's the argument. So some of the opposition is that people do fear they will need to change who they are. There's this sense of loss of independence. I think that's a fear. Some people also believe that, I would say mistakenly, that the social inequalities have already been addressed. We're done. We're past that, and that it's not necessary anymore, that it's being forced into workplaces or government offices and it's no longer necessary. It's being overdone kind of thing. And I think the statistics that we talked about a lot last week prove that that's not necessarily true. So I think some of those issues of fear and concern, there's psychological fears also about perhaps an opportunity is being given to, as we mentioned, someone else by virtue of their gender or skin color, where another person was perhaps more deserving. There's this sense of, do certain people deserve these jobs more? And if they don't get them, was it because of race or gender that promoted someone? Those are fears. They're real human fears. Again, I don't think they're all accurate, but I think we have to acknowledge them and look at them to really think about how we all get along in our diverse nation.
Well, and I think we touched on this last time, the scapegoat. Like
Yes.
sometimes it's easier to have a scapegoat than deal with the evolving nature and realities of who we are as a multicultural country. So when we're looking at our the statement, and I think one of our key takeaways today is whether it's gender equality, whether it's robust, intentional creation of a diverse workforce or diverse organizations, why is this better for people, Scott? And I think that we need to underline that, and that people thrive and communities thrive and companies thrive when there is diversity at the table and more voices.
Yeah, it's practical, as we mentioned, the business case. It's also political. We're a diverse nation. We all need to understand one another for all of us to thrive. When a whole community thrives, we all do better. It's that notion. If the state is doing well, our state just here in Florida is phenomenally diverse. I don't represent the Venezuelan or the Cuban community in Miami, for example, but we need to hear their voices as well. So it's a question of hearing all those voices so that we can function politically for all of our benefits. I would also argue, excuse me, that there's a moral or an ethical reason for it, that if you believe in fundamental human equality, then we do need to make an effort to make sure all of our voices are heard in one way or another. And we have to be honest that that has not always been the case. I think that's another reason why some people oppose measures to bring in more people who have been historically marginalized. Again, that's often women, people of color in this country, historically marginalized from positions of power, is because there's sometimes then people have to confront, is it implicit responsibility or historical guilt that has kept it that way? We have to be honest about our history. Some of it is not just American. I mean, women didn't have the right to vote throughout much of the world until the 1920s, for heaven's sakes. That wasn't an American failing, but it is accurate history. We have to be honest about it, So I think it's important that we can honestly look at where we've been and not be afraid to look at that. I know that's not universal, but not be afraid to look at that and say, okay, we have evolved. We are changing. And we need to recognize the diversity we are today.
And if some of our listeners, our many listeners, are in a situation where this topic comes up, and there's certainly a lot of opportunity for this topic to come up when statements are being made by either elected or appointed officials that competent white men are the way forward. What's a good pushback, or maybe not pushback, maybe that's the wrong word. What's a good way to have a productive conversation on a really difficult narrative on this topic? When we go
Well,
to seek to understand and seek to be more open to conversation.
I usually speak from the heart, so it doesn't work for everyone else. But I would certainly say without any doubt that the world and the US is a diverse place.
Mhm.
And I am open to that and I want to hear it. I think it makes my life not only more productive, but richer and more enjoyable. And that's important as a human value that we would all want. I do think it's also a matter of equal rights. And we are a nation that does believe in equal rights, that all people should have equal rights to opportunity. That's very much something that people in America believe in. I think the devil, as they say, is always in the details about where we are, and I think it is fair to say that certain groups have been historically preferenced, especially white men, things like legacy admissions to colleges, things like preferential admissions to certain places of work.
Mhm.
That is our
Clubs.
history. That is our history. Again, I don't fault, for example, the young men who are here today. That was not their responsibility. I'm not blaming them for it, but we want to be accurate about where we've come from, what the workforce looked like, or what our economic prospects were like. We have to remember just on the economy something that, the wealth gap for women is still about 55 cents to the dollar. I throw that out just because a lot of our lives are dictated by what we can do with resources. If women have essentially half the resources of men in this country, it changes our lives radically, radically. So the notion that we should perpetuate that does not feel at all just to me. And I would hope that women and men wouldn't agree to that. Men have daughters as well. Do they really
Mhm.
want their daughters, for example, even if not for themselves? Do they want their daughters to have that lack of justice? I hope not.
Yeah. So, as we
Seems like a
wrap
good place to
up,
end.
as we wrap up, next episode, care
Yes,
economy.
care economy and all its, well, not all its manifestations, because that's awfully big, but we are going to get into the care economy, what it means,
Mhm.
what it looks like, and why it's important.
Absolutely. As always, thank you for your approach and your input on some really difficult topics. And I always appreciate our conversation, Scott.
Thank you, Ashley. See you next time.
All right, see you next time on A Woman's Place with Scott and Ashley.